People rarely remember the person who switched on a light, until the night the darkness finally mattered. The last shuttle had departed almost an hour earlier, leaving the Orion Interstellar Research Institute wrapped in the kind of silence that only existed after midnight. Endless corridors stretched beneath pale ceiling panels, their polished floors reflecting thin ribbons of artificial light that seemed colder than moonlight. Air filtration units whispered behind steel walls. Cleaning drones hummed somewhere far below the maintenance decks. Every few seconds, a distant ventilation fan sighed through the enormous facility like the building itself was struggling to stay awake. Hallway 17 remained different. Everyone knew it. Scientists hurried past it without slowing down. Security officers avoided looking toward its far end. New employees learned within their first week that asking questions about the girl sitting beyond the reinforced observation door usually ended conversations instead of starting them. Some believed she could hear thoughts. Others insisted electronic systems malfunctioned whenever she became upset. A few claimed they had seen lights flicker around her without explanation. None of those stories had ever been officially confirmed, but rumors traveled through research stations faster than facts. Tonight, like every other night, the hallway stood nearly empty. One overhead fixture blinked once before settling into a steady glow. At the very end of the corridor, beyond layers of transparent shielding, a young alien woman sat perfectly still beside a wide observation window that overlooked nothing except the endless darkness of space. Her blue skin reflected faint silver highlights beneath the dim lighting. Long white hair rested across her shoulders without the slightest movement. Her violet eyes remained fixed on the stars outside, as though she had been counting them for years. She never knocked on the glass. She never called for help. She simply waited in the darkness while the rest of the building pretended she no longer existed. At exactly 11:47 p.m., the squeak of rubber wheels echoed softly through the corridor. Ethan Walker rounded the corner, pushing an aging janitor's cart loaded with cleaning supplies, folded towels, fresh trash liners, and a battered metal toolbox that had survived more years than most of the researchers working upstairs. At 38, Ethan looked like someone who had spent most of his life repairing things nobody else noticed. His brown work jacket carried faint bleach stains despite careful washing. His white maintenance badge had been scratched so many times that only half his last name remained readable. His boots showed the dull wear of thousands of overnight shifts. Nobody important ever stopped to ask how his evening was going. That suited him just fine. He checked the maintenance log clipped to his card, crossed another completed hallway off the list, then glanced automatically toward the final light fixture outside the isolation wing. The bulb had burned out again. Ethan sighed quietly. Third time this month, he muttered to himself. Either somebody keeps forgetting to replace these with the right model, or this hallway just hates light. He parked the cart beneath the fixture, unfolded a small aluminum ladder, and climbed carefully until his fingertips reached the warm glass cover. Within moments, the old bulb rested in his hand. A fresh LED clicked into place. The corridor brightened immediately. The change was subtle, almost unnoticeable to anyone passing through, but at the far end of the hallway, something shifted. Ethan looked down before climbing off the ladder. The alien girl had turned her head ever so slightly. Not enough to meet his eyes, just enough to notice that the light had returned. Neither of them spoke. They never had. Ethan simply packed away the burned-out bulb, folded the ladder, and continued pushing his cart down the polished hallway, unaware that for the first time in weeks, the girl beyond the glass had stopped staring into the darkness and was quietly watching the man everyone else walked past. Ethan never considered himself invisible. He simply understood that people noticed clean floors only when they were dirty and working lights only after they failed. That was the unwritten rule of maintenance. If everything worked, nobody remembered the person who kept it that way. Every evening at exactly 6 o'clock, he arrived through the employee entrance carrying the same weathered lunch bag and the same stainless steel travel mug filled with black coffee that had long since become more habit than necessity. He greeted the receptionist by name, nodded to the security officers changing shifts, and disappeared into the maze of service corridors before the scientists began their overnight experiments. His routine rarely changed. Empty trash bins, Polish observation windows, replace air filters, tighten loose handrails, record maintenance requests, finish with hallway 17 just before midnight. Most employees planned their routes specifically to avoid that corridor. Ethan did not understand why. The hallway was quieter than the others, certainly, but quiet never bothered him. Years before joining the institute, he had worked night shifts maintaining an elementary school, where empty classrooms had taught him that silence often carried more kindness than crowded rooms ever could. During one of his first weeks at Orion, another janitor named Carl had stopped him outside the supply room and lowered his voice. Word of advice, the older man had said while sorting replacement bulbs into labeled bins. Do your work around 17 if you have to, but do not linger. People who get curious around that girl never stay long. Ethan had frowned. Did something happen? Carl had shrugged without meeting his eyes. Depends on who you ask. Everybody has a story. Nobody has proof. That answer had bothered Ethan ever since. Rumors without facts always seemed unfair. Over the following months, he listened without asking questions. In the employee cafeteria, he overheard researchers whispering that the alien species communicated in ways humans could not measure. A pair of interns insisted she had once disabled an entire laboratory simply by becoming frightened. One security officer claimed she had not spoken a full sentence in nearly 2 years. Another insisted she refused every psychological evaluation offered to her. Every version contradicted the last. The only consistent detail was that everyone stayed away. Ethan trusted what he could see more than what he could hear. What he saw each night never matched the stories. He saw a young woman sitting quietly beside the observation window. He saw untouched books stacked neatly on a shelf inside her room. He noticed that someone delivered meals 3 times a day, and almost every tray returned with little more than a few bites missing. He noticed that every Thursday a fresh blanket appeared folded on the chair beside her, yet she always used the older gray one instead. Small details revealed habits, and habits revealed people. None of those details resembled the monster described in the break room conversations. Near midnight, Ethan finished wiping fingerprints from the reinforced glass outside the isolation suite. As he packed away the cleaning cloth, his reflection briefly overlapped with hers. She remained seated exactly where she had been the night before, but this time her gaze lingered on the newly installed light overhead instead of the darkness beyond the window. For only a second, her expression softened into something almost peaceful before she quietly looked away again. Ethan pushed his cart farther down the corridor without saying a word, but somewhere deep inside, he found himself wondering whether the brightest thing in hallway 17 had never been the light above the ceiling at all. The following evening arrived wrapped in the same quiet rhythm that governed every overnight shift at Orion. Yet something almost impossible happened before Ethan even reached hallway 17. 2 research assistants standing beside the elevator stopped talking the moment they noticed his maintenance cart heading toward the isolation wing. One of them shook his head. "You are replacing that light again?" he asked. Ethan glanced at the box of spare bulbs resting beside his toolbox. "Just making sure it stays working." The younger assistant frowned. "You know she notices that, right?" Ethan rested both hands on the cart handle. "I figured everybody notices when a light goes out." The assistant exchanged an uneasy look with his colleague before lowering his voice. "That is not what I meant." They walked away before Ethan could ask another question. The unfinished conversation lingered in his thoughts as he continued down the polished corridor. Every rumor inside Orion seemed to end exactly the same way. Half a sentence, a nervous glance, then silence. The farther he traveled toward the isolation wing, the emptier the building became. Laboratory doors remained sealed behind layers of reinforced glass. Security cameras tracked each intersection with quiet mechanical precision. The faint scent of disinfectant mixed with the metallic smell of recycled air drifting through hidden vents overhead. Hallway 17 welcomed him with its familiar stillness. The new bulb still burned with a warm white glow exactly as it had the previous night. Ethan smiled faintly. At least this one survived 24 hours. He parked his cart beside the observation window and began wiping fingerprints from the glass with slow, practiced movements. The transparent barrier reflected his sleeves, his bucket, and the gentle circles of his cleaning cloth until another reflection gradually appeared beside his own. Lyra stood only a few feet away on the opposite side of the glass. Ethan had never seen her standing before. She was taller than he expected, almost 6 feet, with graceful posture despite the oversized gray sweater draped loosely across her shoulders. Her blue skin carried delicate silver patterns that shimmered softly whenever the ceiling light shifted overhead. She looked less like someone dangerous and more like someone who had forgotten what it felt like to belong anywhere. Their reflections overlapped for a brief moment before Ethan quietly lowered his cloth. Neither of them spoke. Lyra tilted her head slightly, as though studying a puzzle no one else had noticed. Her violet eyes settled not on his face, but on the maintenance badge hanging from his jacket. Ethan instinctively looked down. Half his last name had worn away years ago. Walker had become simply Wall. For reasons he could not explain, he suddenly felt embarrassed by the faded plastic card. Lyra lifted one slender hand and pointed gently toward the ceiling fixture outside her room. Then she looked back at him. The gesture lasted barely a second, but Ethan understood it immediately. She was not pointing at the hallway. She was pointing at the light. He nodded almost without thinking. "You are welcome," he whispered through the glass, even though he doubted she could hear him. Something changed in her expression. Not a smile. Not quite. More like the cautious recognition of someone discovering that kindness could exist without asking for anything in return. She slowly lowered her hand and stepped backward into the room again. At that exact moment, a security officer turned the corner carrying an electronic inspection tablet. He stopped abruptly after noticing Ethan facing the observation window. "Maintenance," the officer called, his voice sharper than necessary. "You finished here?" Ethan picked up his cloth and resumed cleaning as naturally as he could. "Almost done." The officer glanced through the glass toward Lyra. She had already returned to her chair beside the stars as though she had never moved at all. The officer frowned. "Strange," he muttered. "She never comes near the window." Ethan looked at the fresh circles of light reflected across the polished floor. For the first time since arriving at Orion, he realized the stories everyone repeated might not be hiding the truth. They might simply be missing the smallest part of it. Over the next several weeks, the Institute continued exactly as it always had, at least on the surface. Research teams rotated through endless experiments. Cargo shuttles arrived before sunrise, carrying sealed containers from distant colonies. Engineers argued over calibration reports in brightly lit conference rooms, while administrators hurried between meetings with digital tablets pressed against their chests. Orion remained one of humanity's most respected research facilities because everyone believed every important discovery happened inside laboratories. Nobody paid attention to the quiet work taking place in the hallways after midnight. Ethan settled into his familiar routine with the steady patience that had shaped his entire adult life. Every evening, he inspected hallway 17 before beginning the rest of his maintenance route. If the overhead fixture showed even the slightest flicker, he replaced it before anyone else noticed. If the temperature inside the corridor dropped a few degrees below the standard setting, he filed a maintenance request himself instead of waiting for complaints that never came. One Thursday evening, he discovered the air vent nearest the observation room blowing noticeably colder than the others. He spent nearly 40 minutes adjusting the damaged regulator until warm air flowed quietly through the corridor once again. Nobody thanked him. Nobody even knew he had done it. That never bothered him. Small problems deserved small solutions. One night, while organizing supply shelves, Ethan noticed an unopened box of individually wrapped hot cocoa packets that had been ordered for a winter employee appreciation event months earlier. The expiration date was still months away. Most people ignored them in favor of expensive coffee from the cafeteria upstairs. Ethan slipped a single packet into his lunch bag without giving it much thought. Later that evening, after finishing his cleaning outside the isolation suite, he stopped beside the employee beverage station tucked into a corner of the maintenance corridor. Steam drifted gently upward as hot water filled a plain insulated paper cup. Rich chocolate filled the air with a comforting smell that reminded him of snowy evenings from his childhood in northern Minnesota, where his mother believed a warm drink could fix almost any difficult day. He carried the cup toward hallway 17 before stopping several feet from the observation window. Food deliveries were handled through secured systems inside the room, and he knew the Institute had strict rules about direct contact. He respected those rules. Instead, he placed the untouched cup on a small maintenance counter outside the glass, where employees occasionally left repair logs and inspection forms. He hesitated for a moment, then pulled a black marker from his jacket pocket and wrote 4 simple words across the lid. For cold nights only. No signature. No explanation. Just the words. Ethan quietly returned to his cart and continued polishing the corridor as though nothing unusual had happened. Nearly 20 minutes passed before Lyra slowly approached the observation window again. She noticed the cup immediately. Her eyes rested on the handwritten message much longer than Ethan expected. She looked around the empty hallway, then toward him. He pretended to focus on a nearby floor buffer, giving her the privacy he imagined she would want. A few moments later, the service hatch built into the lower section of the observation wall opened with a soft mechanical click as part of its scheduled supply cycle. The insulated cup disappeared inside. Ethan smiled without looking up. The following evening, when he reached the corridor again, the empty paper cup sat neatly on the same maintenance counter where he had left it. It had been carefully rinsed clean. Folded beneath it rested a tiny square of white paper no larger than a sticky note. There were only 2 handwritten words in graceful, unfamiliar lettering translated automatically by the Institute's universal print system beneath them. Thank you. Ethan stood perfectly still, holding the note between work-worn fingers while the hallway remained silent around him. Somewhere beyond the reinforced glass, Lyra had returned to her chair beside the stars, but for the first time since arriving at Orion, the silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt shared. Kindness has a quiet way of changing more than the person who receives it. Sometimes it changes the people who happen to witness it. Ethan did not realize anyone had been paying attention until the following Monday. He had just finished replacing a worn floor panel outside the engineering wing when a young systems technician named Noah Brooks stepped into the maintenance corridor carrying a stack of diagnostic tablets. Noah looked barely 26, with untidy brown hair and the restless energy of someone who spent more time solving computer problems than sleeping. He hesitated before approaching Ethan. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Ethan tightened the final screw and stood slowly. "Sure." Noah glanced around to make certain nobody else was nearby. "Every night around midnight, do you go to hallway 17? Ethan nodded. "It is part of my route." Noah shifted awkwardly. "Not exactly what I meant." Ethan waited patiently. People usually finished speaking if someone gave them enough silence. Noah finally sighed. "I was reviewing security footage after a sensor malfunction last week. Your maintenance card appeared in several recordings. At first I thought you were investigating equipment problems, but then I noticed something else." Ethan folded the screwdriver into his toolbox without answering. "You always stop there," Noah continued. "You replace lights before they burn out. You adjust the temperature. You leave warm drinks. You even polish the observation window more carefully than every other piece of glass in the building." Ethan smiled faintly. "Dirty windows block the view." Noah shook his head. "Nobody has looked through that window in years." Ethan closed the toolbox with a soft click. "One person does." The words lingered between them. Noah looked down at the floor for several seconds before speaking again. "Do you know what people say about her?" "I know what people repeat," Ethan answered. "That is different." Noah frowned. "You are not afraid?" Ethan rested both hands on the handle of his maintenance cart. "Should I be afraid of someone who says thank you?" Noah blinked. "She thanked you." Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded the tiny square of paper he had been carrying since the previous week. The handwritten words had become slightly creased from being opened so many times, but they remained perfectly clear. Noah stared at the note as though it belonged to an entirely different story than the one he thought he understood. "I have worked here almost 4 years," he whispered. "I have never heard anyone say she speaks." Ethan carefully folded the note again and returned it to his pocket. Maybe nobody ever gave her a reason. Noah had no reply. Later that evening, the conversation remained in Ethan's thoughts as he pushed his cart toward the isolation wing. The hallway looked exactly the same as always, yet something felt subtly different. When he rounded the final corner, he noticed the overhead light already glowing with steady warmth. Beneath it sat another small folded note resting on the maintenance counter. Ethan opened it carefully. The handwriting was still elegant and deliberate. This time the message contained only one sentence. "The hallway feels warmer before you arrive now." Ethan looked through the observation window. Lyra stood beside the stars once again, her hands loosely folded in front of her. She did not wave. She simply met his eyes for a brief moment before turning back toward the darkness beyond the glass. Ethan glanced up at the quiet light shining above them. He knew perfectly well that the temperature sensors showed only a 2-degree increase after he repaired the vent. Yet somehow the corridor truly did feel warmer, and for the first time he wondered whether warmth had ever been measured correctly by machines at all. The storm announced itself long before the first alarm sounded. At 11:18 that Thursday night, the lights across Orion flickered so briefly that most people dismissed it as another harmless fluctuation in the station's aging power grid. Ethan noticed it immediately. He was replacing an access panel inside the maintenance tunnel beneath the Western laboratory when every fluorescent strip above him dimmed for less than a second before returning to full brightness. He slowly looked toward the ceiling. Electrical systems rarely blinked without a reason. A faint crackle rolled through the ventilation ducts, followed by the low mechanical voice of the station's automated network. Attention! External plasma activity detected. Switching to reinforced grid configuration. Please stand by. Ethan climbed out of the maintenance shaft and wiped dust from his hands. Through the narrow service window, he could see enormous blue and violet waves rippling across the distant sky outside the station's transparent dome. Charged particles from a solar storm danced silently above the planet, beautiful enough to stop anyone from speaking. Beautiful things, he had learned, could still cause problems. He pushed his cart toward hallway 17 a little faster than usual. Along the way, employees filled the corridors carrying data drives, portable equipment, and emergency checklists. Laboratory supervisors spoke rapidly into communication devices while security teams verified sealed access points. Nobody appeared frightened, but everyone moved with the calm urgency that accompanied carefully rehearsed emergency procedures. As Ethan reached the isolation wing, another announcement echoed through the building. Warning: main power instability detected. Non-essential systems preparing for temporary shutdown. Backup generators standing by. The familiar ceiling light outside Lyra's room hummed softly. Ethan instinctively looked up at it. The glow remained steady, but only barely. He walked over to the electrical access cabinet hidden behind a maintenance panel and scanned the power readings. Voltage fluctuations. Worse than he expected. He replaced one damaged relay and tightened two loose connections, hoping it would buy the circuit a little more time. When he looked through the observation window, Lyra was already standing. She was not watching the stars tonight. She was watching the light. Her violet eyes followed every tiny flicker overhead with growing uneasiness. Ethan offered a reassuring nod, raising one thumb as though everything was perfectly under control. She held his gaze for a moment before giving the smallest nod in return. Then the entire station shuddered. Not violently, only enough for the floor beneath Ethan's boots to vibrate with a deep metallic rumble. Every light along the corridor dimmed at once. Emergency sirens remained silent, but the calm computerized voice returned with words Ethan had never heard before. Critical warning. Main reactor disconnected from external grid. Emergency power activation delayed. Please remain where you are. For half a heartbeat, the hallway existed in absolute darkness. Then faint red emergency strips embedded near the floor blinked weakly to life, casting long crimson reflections across the polished corridor. They were nowhere near bright enough to replace the overhead fixtures. Ethan's eyes adjusted quickly. Through the observation glass, he searched for Lyra. She had stepped backward until her shoulders touched the far wall. Her breathing had become visibly faster. Her hands were pressed tightly together against her sweater, as though she were trying to steady herself without making a sound. She was not acting like someone dangerous. She looked like someone desperately trying not to panic. Ethan reached instinctively for the familiar switch controlling the hallway lights, even though he already knew it would do nothing. The fixture above the corridor gave one final weak pulse before fading completely into darkness. The only remaining illumination came from the tiny emergency strips tracing the floor like fading embers. Ethan stood motionless for only a second before opening the maintenance compartment beneath his cart. Resting inside was a heavy industrial emergency lantern, the kind used during complete power failures. He wrapped his fingers around its handle, took a slow breath, and silently prayed the battery was still fully charged. The brightest light in a crisis is not always the strongest one. Sometimes it is simply the one that refuses to go out. Ethan pressed the power switch on the industrial lantern, and a steady circle of warm white light immediately pushed back the darkness surrounding him. The beam spread across the polished floor, climbed the reinforced walls, and settled against the observation window with a gentle glow that looked almost comforting compared to the cold red emergency strips below. He lifted the lantern slightly higher so it could be seen from inside the room. Through the glass, Lyra's eyes found the light almost instantly. Her shoulders remained tense, but the frantic movement in her breathing slowed ever so slightly. Ethan stayed exactly where he was. He remembered something his mother had once told him after a thunderstorm had frightened him as a little boy. When someone is afraid, do not tell them the darkness is not real. Show them they are not alone inside it. He rested the lantern on the maintenance counter directly beside the observation window, allowing its warm glow to fill both sides of the glass. The battery indicator showed 92%. If the specifications printed on the housing were accurate, it would shine for nearly 10 hours before fading. That was longer than most emergency outages ever lasted. A security officer hurried into the corridor carrying a portable communicator whose screen flickered with unstable signals. He stopped abruptly after seeing Ethan standing beside the isolation suite. "Walker," he called, "you need to report to the central shelter. Non-essential personnel are being relocated." Ethan looked toward the dark room beyond the glass, then back at the officer. "She is alone." The officer followed his gaze before answering quietly. "She has emergency protocols." Ethan nodded. "So does everyone else. That does not mean they should face this by themselves." The officer hesitated, obviously weighing procedure against common sense. Before either man could continue, the communication device emitted a burst of static and went completely silent. The officer sighed in frustration. "Stay here if you must," he finally said. "Just keep your radio on." Ethan gave a grateful nod. As the officer disappeared into the darkness, the hallway became silent once more except for the distant hum of backup generators slowly trying to recover. Minutes passed, then another hour. Ethan sat down on the floor beside his maintenance cart with the lantern resting between himself and the observation window. He unfolded a clean shop towel and placed it beneath the lantern so the polished surface would not become scratched. Small habits mattered, even during emergencies. Inside the room, Lyra slowly crossed the distance to the glass. Instead of retreating into the shadows as she usually did, she lowered herself onto the floor opposite Ethan. Only the transparent barrier separated them. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. The warm circle of light reflected across the glass until it became impossible to tell which side it truly belonged to. Ethan reached into his lunch bag and found the peanut butter sandwich he had never eaten during his break. He smiled to himself before taking a small bite. Across from him, Lyra watched with quiet curiosity. After a moment, she disappeared from view and returned carrying a well-worn hardcover book from the shelf behind her chair. She opened it on her lap and began reading beneath the lantern's glow. Ethan could not understand the elegant symbols printed across its pages, but he recognized something far more important. She was reading because she finally felt safe enough to do something ordinary. Time drifted forward without urgency. Somewhere deep inside the station, generators gradually restored scattered sections of electricity. A few distant lights blinked back to life, but hallway 17 remained dark except for the lantern Ethan had carried there himself. Just before 2 o'clock in the morning, Lyra gently placed one hand against the observation glass. Ethan looked up from the maintenance manual he had been pretending to read and quietly raised his own hand to the opposite side. The glass between them remained cold and unbroken, yet for the first time since either of them had entered that hallway, neither side felt quite as isolated as before. By sunrise, the emergency generators finally synchronized with the station's primary systems, and one section after another slowly returned to life. Ceiling lights blinked awake across Orion with a quiet mechanical rhythm, ventilation fans resumed their familiar whisper, and computer terminals displayed long streams of recovery diagnostics. Hallway 17 was one of the last areas to receive full power. When the overhead fixture finally glowed again, Ethan switched off the lantern and smiled at the battery indicator, which still showed enough charge to keep shining for several more hours. He carefully wiped the lantern clean with a soft cloth before placing it back inside his maintenance cart, as though it had completed the most important repair of its life. Lyra remained seated beside the observation window, but there was something unmistakably different about her. The constant tension that had once surrounded her had eased. She no longer stared only at the stars beyond the glass. Every few moments her eyes drifted toward the hallway where Ethan quietly packed away his tools. Neither of them noticed Noah Brooks, standing several yards away holding a diagnostic tablet against his chest. He had arrived to inspect communication failures caused by the plasma storm, but instead he found himself watching something that no equipment manual could explain. After Ethan disappeared around the corner to answer another maintenance request, Noah approached the observation window alone. Lyra looked at him briefly before returning her attention to the restored ceiling light. Noah hesitated, then activated his tablet and opened the Institute's restricted behavioral records. Curiosity had finally become stronger than rumor. The file required 3 levels of authorization before it unlocked. Confidential Psychological Observation Report. Subject, Lyra Velis. Noah expected warnings about aggression, instability, or dangerous abilities. Instead, he found a report written nearly 3 years earlier by the Institute's former chief xenopsychologist. The opening sentence stopped him completely. Subject exhibits severe photophobic isolation trauma following prolonged confinement during pre-rescue captivity. Continuous exposure to total darkness triggers acute panic responses. Stable environmental lighting significantly reduces psychological distress. Noah continued reading with growing disbelief. Another section explained that Lyra had never intentionally harmed anyone inside Orion. Several early electrical disturbances had been caused not by hostility, but by involuntary neurological responses during episodes of extreme fear. Misinterpretation of those incidents had gradually isolated her from nearly every member of the staff. The final recommendation carried a digital signature dated almost 2 years before. Maintain consistent illumination and regular compassionate human interaction whenever possible. Noah lowered the tablet slowly. The recommendation had been buried beneath hundreds of technical reports and administrative updates until almost nobody remembered it existed. Yet without ever reading a single classified document, the station's overnight janitor had unknowingly done exactly what the specialists had recommended all along. That afternoon, Noah requested access to archived maintenance footage from the previous 6 months. Video after video showed the same quiet routine. Ethan replacing light bulbs before they dimmed. Ethan repairing vents. Ethan leaving warm drinks. Ethan sitting patiently beside the observation window during the blackout without expecting recognition or reward. Noah exported the recordings and carried them directly to Director Helen Mercer. The station director watched every minute in complete silence. When the final recording ended, she removed her glasses and looked through the office window toward the sprawling research complex below. "All this time," she said softly, "we believed we were protecting the Institute from her." Noah nodded. Instead, someone else was protecting her from feeling abandoned. Director Mercer closed the confidential report and rested one hand on it for several thoughtful seconds. "Schedule a full review of every restriction placed on Lyra Velis," she said, "and bring me every maintenance request submitted by Ethan Walker during the past year." Noah looked surprised. "Everyone." She smiled sadly. "If the person who understood our most misunderstood resident best has been quietly telling us what she needed all along, then perhaps it is finally time we started listening." 1 year later, almost nothing at Orion looked exactly the same, although most visitors would never have noticed why. Hallway 17 no longer carried the quiet weight of whispered rumors. The reinforced observation room still stood where it always had, but its heavy isolation protocols had been replaced with a bright research studio filled with books, living plants from half a dozen worlds, and wide panoramic windows that welcomed natural sunlight every morning. The overhead lights remained warm throughout the day and never dimmed without a technician arriving within minutes to replace them. It had become the most carefully maintained corridor in the entire facility, not because regulations demanded it, but because everyone finally understood why light mattered there. Lyra Velis no longer spent her days behind silent glass. With guidance from the Institute's medical and psychological teams, she gradually returned to collaborative research, offering insights into stellar navigation and alien communication systems that astonished scientists who had once been too afraid to speak with her. The same employees who had once hurried past her hallway now stopped to ask thoughtful questions or simply wished her a good morning before beginning their shifts. She greeted each of them with the same quiet grace she had always possessed. The difference was not in who she had become. The difference was that people had finally taken the time to see who she had been all along. Ethan Walker, meanwhile, continued arriving every evening at 6 o'clock carrying the same weathered lunch bag and the same stainless steel travel mug filled with black coffee. His maintenance route remained almost identical. Empty trash bins, replace filters, repair loose handrails, polish windows until they reflected the station lights like still water. He never asked for recognition because he had never believed kindness was something a person performed in exchange for applause. One evening, as he pushed his familiar cart toward the engineering wing, Director Helen Mercer stepped into the corridor beside him. "Mr. Walker," she said with a warm smile, "would you mind taking a short detour?" Ethan looked mildly puzzled but nodded. Together they walked toward the hallway that had quietly changed all of their lives. Waiting there were researchers, engineers, security officers, maintenance workers, and administrators standing shoulder to shoulder beneath newly installed ceiling lights that bathed the corridor in gentle golden warmth. Noah Brooks stood near the front holding the same diagnostic tablet that had uncovered the forgotten report months earlier. Lyra waited beside him, no longer separated by reinforced glass, dressed in a simple blue research uniform with a small institute identification badge clipped proudly to her jacket. Ethan stopped pushing his cart. "Did I miss a maintenance request?" he asked with an uncertain smile. Soft laughter echoed through the hallway. Director Mercer shook her head. "Actually," she replied, "you answered one long before the rest of us even knew it existed." She reached toward the wall beside the observation suite and gently pulled away a dark blue cloth covering a newly mounted bronze plaque. Beneath it were engraved just a few simple words. "Walker Corridor." A reminder that the smallest act of kindness can illuminate what fear leaves in darkness. Ethan stared at the plaque for several silent seconds before rubbing the back of his neck in quiet embarrassment. "I only changed a few light bulbs," he said. Lyra stepped forward with calm, steady eyes and smiled in a way he had never seen before. "No," she answered softly. "You reminded one forgotten person that someone would come back tomorrow." The hallway grew completely still. No applause followed. None was needed. Above them the lights continued shining with the same steady warmth they always had, reflecting gently across polished floors that Ethan himself had cleaned countless nights before. Outside the enormous station windows, thousands of distant stars stretched across the endless darkness of space. But inside Orion another truth had quietly taken root. The brightest light in any galaxy is rarely the one that can be seen from the farthest distance. More often, it is the one a kind human chooses to leave on for someone who believes the whole universe has forgotten they are there.